We have a full play now. This is the final reading that we have for the semester. It's probably one of the harder readings, sorry, but it does take some getting used to. Shakespeare does. And before we start, and this is just for you three who are in here chatting with me, could you let me know just in the chat what Shakespeare you have read before? When I was in high school, I read quite a few, but I actually took in high school in my senior year, I took a independent study. And by the time I graduated from high school, I read 26 of his 37 plays. So if you could just type in there, and you can use the initials, I'll probably figure it out, R and J and stuff like that. But let me know what you have read, because this will give me somewhere to go from. And while you're writing, my plan is to get all of the chats done and hopefully cover as much of the play as possible today, and then Tuesday in the morning and in the evening. Okay, R and J. And then whatever we don't get to, I'm just going to probably Wednesday morning set up a session and just record what's left, kind of like the way I did with the Doll's House, did that part 4. I didn't intend to with part 4, but only one person showed up for the Thursday morning in my other class, and she had not finished the play yet, so I couldn't, I didn't want to ruin it for her. So, okay, so one of you has read Romeo and Juliet. Hamlet, which is one of my absolute favorites. The best Hamlet film version ever is by Kenneth Branagh, and the best Henry V version I've ever seen is also Kenneth Branagh, his version. But his Hamlet it's like, okay, if he could take how I interpret Hamlet and make it into a movie, that's, you know. And then A Comedy of Errors, I have seen A Comedy of Errors several times. Once I saw it in Tallahassee at Florida State, actually, and it was very well done. It was super funny. But most people don't think about Shakespeare and think of comedy. Most of you, okay, and most people, when they think of Shakespeare, they think of things like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth is a very common one that people read in high school. It's not my favorite, but it is a very common one, otherwise known as the Scottish play, if you ask any theater people, because they won't say it, the name. They supposedly it's bad luck, which I think is dumb, but theater people can often be superstitious. But the truth is he wrote many different kinds of plays. And usually when we hear about them, we hear tragedies, comedies, and histories. But at the time he wrote, a tragedy wasn't necessarily all depressing, and a comedy wasn't necessarily funny. It all depended upon the end. Now, the truth is, he wrote a bunch of histories, mostly about a lot of the kings during the War of the Roses, which happened kind of between before Henry VIII and all that stuff we talked about. Henry VII was the first king of the house of the Tudors. The second king was Henry VIII, the one who had 6 wives. And then Mary, who was Bloody Mary because she was Catholic. And then Elizabeth I, who reigned for like 50 years. Elizabeth, she's the Virgin Queen. That's what a lot of people call it. But Elizabeth was around when Shakespeare was writing all of this. And so we think much of what he wrote as far as the histories was meant to make the Tudors look really good, because that way he didn't end up in jail or, ticking off the queen or something like that. So some of those were more political. They're still really good. Henry V is an excellent play. And there are other history plays that I actually really enjoy too. Richard II, I really like. Richard III, while it's really, Richard III as a character is a complete creep, it's still an interesting, it's almost a tragedy though, because it ends with Richard III being essentially deposed, but he was a bad king anyway. So anyway, but a lot of us think of the tragedies, and if we think of the comedies, there are very few. Like A Comedy of Errors is one. Midsummer Night's Dream is probably one that most of you have heard of. The best version of Midsummer Night's Dream is actually in Central Park. So it's Shakespeare in Central Park. And it actually had William Hurt, whom you might recognize from an older, somewhat older movies. But he was Oberon, the king of the fairies in it. But it was excellent. It's so funny. And the first one I ever saw was Taming of the Shrew, but I saw it live. I actually saw it at the Utah Shakespearean Festival. I don't know. That's really, I have not heard that. Richard III was, I know, at least according to the play, he was supposed to be a hunchback, but the real Richard III was not a hunchback. So Shakespeare kind of invented that. And there are all sorts of reasons, as theories as to why he might have done that. But Richard III is a much maligned. He was the one who was blamed for the two babies, for the two little boys who were put in the tower, the two sons, and then they disappeared and no one ever found them again. And he was at that time the Lord Protector of the state. He was, because they weren't adults yet. They were very young. And most people believe that he killed them, but we don't know. But the truth is there is even another group. So we have the comedies and the tragedies and the histories. Well, these are, what the Tempest is what they call a romance. In truth, though, at the time, it would have been a comedy. Oh, Addie came. Thank you so much for letting me know so I could mark her down too. Hey, Addie. Okay, so this is, a lot of people call it a romance, but it's really a comedy for one reason. The big difference between tragedies and comedies in the time of Shakespeare was that comedies ended with a wedding or some type of romantic alliance between two people. And a tragedy ended with somebody dying. Sometimes lots of people dying. I think Hamlet took the cake. No, King Lear, where people died and died and died and died and died and died, and extra died, and all these people are dead at the end. And there's hardly anybody left. Hamlet and King Lear are both kind of like that. But it's really, that's what, can there be comedic moments to tragedy? Yes. Can there be serious moments to comedy? Yes. And the histories are kind of a mixture of both. In this case, though, and what makes this play stand out as far as Shakespeare's is that it is often considered to be his last play. And so there are a lot of allusions to magic, to imagination. And if you think of Prospero as Shakespeare, there's definitely an awareness that I've been playing with magic for quite some time, and now I'm done. And that's gonna come across by the time we get to the end of the play, is that all of the time for making magic is over. I'm retiring. This is like a retirement play, if you want to think about it that way. And Prospero is there is a movie version, but it's not good. And it's very it goes off the deep end. It's kind of like the movie version of Beowulf goes off the deep end. It's really boring, honestly. Okay, and if I say it's boring, it really is. But there's some really good versions. In fact, I saw it in a community theater in Tallahassee just in the summer. I think it was in the summer. I saw this particular play. This is also one of the ones I saw first. So when I first went to the Shakespearean Festival, I saw Troilus and Cressida, which is not great. It's based on the Iliad, essentially. It's based on the war with Troy, between Greece and Troy. So if you like all that kind of stuff, it has Achilles in it and stuff like that. It has a very unsatisfying ending. But then I also saw The Tempest and Taming the Shrew, which are still two of my favorites. I really like Taming the Shrew. It's a mixture of culture where you see what women's roles are and of kind of women's liberation. It's really fascinating. And the version of it with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, who were married at the time that they did the movie, is great. So I highly recommend that, Taming the Shrew. It's quite fun. Okay, Antony and Cleopatra, as far as a play, is great. And in fact, but the version, like they have a Cleopatra thing on Netflix, and it's actually really boring. But if you see Elizabeth Taylor's one, it's actually a mixture of Caesar and Cleopatra that was written by George Bernard Shaw. I'll put him in here. And he wrote a play called Caesar and Cleopatra, because Cleopatra actually had a romantic affair with Julius Caesar, and his only child is hers. His name is Caesarion. That's in real life. But the play actually deals with him when he meets her as a young woman. But then essentially the Elizabeth Taylor really long movie, which is so worth watching in my opinion. For the costumes alone, it's great. But the second half of it is Antony and Cleopatra, and that's the Shakespeare play. And it's very sad. It's a tragedy, but yes, that's exactly it. And that's from George Bernard Shaw's play. So the movie is actually an adaptation and stick together kind of thing of two plays by very different authors. And yet you can find some of the exact lines are still in the play. I mean, in the movie. It's quite well done. That's my opinion. You guys can hate it if you want. I don't care. Okay. The other thing is, and this is something that I always bring up. Well, that's because she cared about, doing it well. Anyway, so the only other thing I can tell you, and this is something that's a little bit weird. I will not test you on this, but I want you to just kind of be aware that it's out there. There are a lot of theories about Shakespeare's authorship and about the fact that maybe other people wrote other people wrote his plays and he didn't. We know that William Shakespeare, it's actually spelled like, it's either this way or that way. We know that William Shakespeare did come to London, and he was an actor, and he played older men roles. He played like the ghost in Hamlet and stuff like that. But Shakespeare, when everything was published, all of it was published like this. And that's not typical, and nobody's name is actually that. There's no hyphenated Shakespeare anywhere in England. And yet it's probably my favorite theory. I think it's fascinating. There's a movie about it too, but I'll list that too. But that there's a theory that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and Chancellor of England, actually, right under Elizabeth I, and he was also Catholic. He was the real writer. And there are a lot of people who are what they call Oxfordians. In fact, a lot of very famous actors are Oxfordians, including Kenneth Branagh. And what they just believe is that this guy who was Chancellor of England and he was an earl could not publish popular plays and do that, without putting a pen name on them. And so he wrote them for the plays, but he never performed except at court. We know he wrote a bunch of poetry too, but all of it was destroyed when he died. His wife was Puritan, and she burned most of it. But some of his friends took a bunch of stuff from his study, and then the folio was actually published after his death. So that's just a little theory. If you're ever interested in it, we can talk more, but I just wanted to put that out there. The main thing I want you to understand too is there's definitely a class system that's going on in this play and in most of Shakespeare's plays, and we're not used to that. I mean, we sort of have it, we have the super rich people, and then we have the super poor people, most of us. But then in much of Europe, that was not the case. And they still, even today, they have what they call the House of Lords, for instance. In England, it has far less power than it used to. The House of Commons is really the group, and they're all elected officials who do most of the rules, and they create the laws, and they change things, and do the funding for the government and stuff like that. The House of Lords was, before then, though, was historically the one in charge, kind of like a parliament, only they were not voted. They essentially inherited their seats from their their fathers. So the oldest son would become a representative within the House of Lords. And it was all that, they had land that would stay with them, that, an inheritance that would automatically, estates that went with the title, and they were all nobility. And so this is the separation. So you're going to find, and I'm going to highlight the people who are upper class. So we have Prospero, and he was the Duke of Milan. You can't get any higher than Duke unless you're a king. Okay, but he was the former Duke of Milan, and he was actually essentially sent by boat and shipped off through a problem. Essentially, a conspiracy was created between his younger brother, Antonio, and the king. So the king essentially worked with him to essentially help that happen. Now, typically, this is not the way it's done here, but typically in an actual folio of this, when you'd see the script, at least the way that Shakespeare would have produced it, Alonso would actually be named first because he is the highest ranking person. So everything would be by rank. Even the fact that Miranda is here second, that would never happen. Miranda would be at the bottom because she's female, and women are automatically ranked below all men. It's very typical. And the rest of these are all, she's the only female in this play, unless, as sometimes happens, and it was, it was in the production I just saw. Sometimes some of the other people are female. So where's the Ariel, the spirit? It's usually, I've seen Ariel as a male and I've seen Ariel as a female, but Ariel is a fairy. So, well, Jordan, you and I can talk Oxfordian theory anytime you want. I found it I actually learned about it when I was a freshman in college, and it completely like messed with my head. Anyway, all of these nymphs and everything, those would also be listed at the bottom because they are not even human. So they would be down with, like, they'd be right below Miranda because she's a girl, and then they're like non-human creatures. Caliban would be down there as well. So we're going to talk about a little bit about these servants, but essentially Prospero would be upper class. Gonzalo would be he would be down a little bit, but he's still a lord serving the Duke and the king. Prospero's brother would be below Prospero because he's not the rightful Duke. He is the usurping Duke. He took the throne, the title from his brother, and sent his brother off to a desert island. Really, he probably sent him off to drown, but he sent him off to a desert island. Ariel would be down at the bottom, but then we have the king and his son. Those would probably be listed first because the king is the highest ranking, and then it's in order of rank. So this is all kind of mixed up, and I don't like it that they did it this way, but that's the way it is here. Then we have like lower class people, and that includes people like, where are they? The master of the ship, the boatswains, the mariners. They're just ordinary dudes, middle class or lower. Then we also have Trinculo, and he's lower class, and Stefano is lower class. They're the two comedic reliefs in this. And so, but they would automatically speak with less precision. They'd have to play they're drunk. And so they walk around slurring everything. Although it's amazing, they have one leather-filled gourd of wine, and yet they manage to be drunk all the way through for days. I don't know how that happens, because that's not enough wine, especially if they're used to drinking a lot. Anyway, and then of course, very bottom would be Ariel, main character of the spirits. Caliban, who is not a spirit. He's actually a misshapen, sort of weird, beastly sort of something. Some people claim that this is based on Travels to the New World, and he's creating some misshapen sort of Native American creature, which is just kind of awful and racist. Shakespeare, shame, I feel like slapping his hand. But in this case, though, he's not saying that he's necessarily like another race. Instead, he's saying he's the son of a witch. And so goodness knows who the witch slept with, but I don't know what it's using. Maybe it's order of, it's not even in order of appearance. So I don't know why they listed it the way. Maybe they just, this person decided, whoever did this publication decided that these were the two main characters, but that's not true. If you put them in actual order, it should be Prospero and then Ariel. Those are the two people who are on the stage the most. So I don't know. I have no idea. I would not have listed it this way. Prospero, I would love to have first, but even he really shouldn't be. It should be the king. Alonso and Ferdinand should come first, then Prospero, then Alonso's brother, who's a prince, Sebastian, and then Antonio, Prospero's brother, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, yeah, well, and the truth is, this is the hardest part about reading a play. In some ways, reading a play is easier because you're reading just dialogue. In the other way, though, it's hard because you have to remember who all these people are, especially when you get to Shakespeare. Most Shakespearean plays have at least 2 or 3 women in them. Most of them don't have many at all. And that's because, well, in histories, they had to have some just to, fill out real characters in history. But the truth is there aren't that many women because no women were allowed on stage at this time. And so all of these parts would have been played by men, even Miranda. In Romeo and Juliet would both be boys. And that's just the way Shakespeare was done. It was not legal for a woman to be on the stage. A woman, God knows what would have happened to her. She would have been put in jail. If you want to see a really good movie about that, that actually has a lot of references to theater, it's a very smart play. See Shakespeare. It's not totally accurate. It's a comedy, but see Shakespeare in Love. That's definitely that's a good way of getting a feel for the theater as well, and what the inside of it was like, what the crowds were like, stuff like that. Also, if you want to see a movie that deals with, it's not a great movie. It's not a great movie. It's not horrible, but it's not great. That deals with the Oxfordian theory. Look up Anonymous. Yeah, I spelled it right. And that's actually about Edward de Vere as if he were Shakespeare. It's cool. I like it. I still own it. It's because it's a fascinating topic to me. Do I know which one's true? No, but it's still fascinating. So yeah, you have to come back and reference these people. Sometimes I might even forget. Oh wait, is Sebastian Alonso's brother or Prospero's brother? And I have to go back and remember. Gonzalo is a figure to remember though, because he's one of the few who is untouched by the corruption. I mean, he's still been serving as a lord all these years, and yet he never betrayed. He actually helped out Prospero when Prospero was being shipped off. So let's look at backstory. Now this kind of starts in the middle of the action because a lot of years have gone past since all this bad stuff happened. Since essentially Alonso, the king of Naples, conspired with Antonio to depose Antonio's brother, take his reign, his dukedom, and then ship Prospero and his daughter Miranda, who was just a baby, off. Prospero was given a book by Gonzalo. That's why I say he's a good dude. He gave him a book and several other books, and Prospero had always been kind of a studious dude, so he had lots of books. But a lot of his books were on magic, and so this is where we get into more of the. They didn't call them magicians back then. It was more of oh, what did they call them? I mean, you could use the word necromancer, but that's not really it. They were trying things like trying to make, lead turn into gold and stuff like that. That was actually an alchemist. That's the word. I knew somebody else would think of it. As far as the king, I'm not sure, Jordan. I don't know that ever gets established. Why did the king help? I mean, the truth is Antonio's a jerk. So why did he help Antonio? Maybe Antonio made promises to him. Maybe Antonio deceived him. Because definitely at the end, Alonso absolutely feels as if what he did was wrong, and he apologizes for it. And he says, I never should have done it. And it may also stem from the fact that, and as Prospero admits himself, he was not exactly the most attentive duke. He was kind of in his studies all the time, working in alchemy or whatever, And so he didn't even realize that all of this subterfuge was happening until he was in a boat floating away. Yeah. And that's certainly what, well, the thing is, though, is Antonio may have promised the king that. So he may have said to, Alonso, if you help me, then you'll have this ally. And the truth is most, like it says, he's king of Naples. Naples is just one little territory. Milan is actually a territory. Now it's a city that, Milan is, but it was a whole territory. Each part of Italy, for instance, was a different dukedom. And so they're all like almost like little city states. And so they would have been allies more than anything else. It's not like the king was somebody that Prospero served under. It's that they were probably in parallel places, and they could create an alliance. And that's probably the number one reason why Alonso did it, is he thought it would help to have those kinds of alliances made. And maybe Prospero didn't make that alliance with him. We don't know. But we know that many years ago, when Miranda was only a couple years old, maybe she was 3, I don't know, it's been like a dozen years or so, so she's still pretty young, but that's normal. They put him and his little baby in a boat. Mom was already out of the picture, she was already dead, but they put them in a boat and they sailed off with some books, literally ended up on this island in the middle of absolute nowhere, jungle or something, and have lived there ever since. So Miranda has only, of all, she really hasn't interacted with all of the fairy creatures either. Prospero is the one who called Ariel to him, essentially made him a servant, well, really a slave, and then essentially kept his freedom from him, and then has him serve and do all sorts of things, and they made a really nice life. But now we are many years later, more than a decade later, and somehow, we don't know exactly how, because Prospero doesn't tell us, but he figures out that Alonso, the king of Naples, and his brother Antonio are on the same ship coming back from a wedding for one of Alonso's kids. Okay. And he finds out they're coming near the island. And so what does he do? He sets all of his fairies, especially Ariel, on creating a storm that's going to drive them onto this island. And we don't know at the beginning, does he want retribution? Is he going to have revenge? Is this a revenge play, which usually was a tragedy where lots of people died? Often the plays at this time that were revenge tragedies could be horribly bloody. Probably the worst was actually, one of the worst was by Shakespeare, and it's Titus Andronicus. And do not watch the movie version. I'll just put the movie is called Titus, unless you have a very strong stomach. It's I mean, it's beautifully done, but it is awful. Yes. Okay. So Jordan, what happens, at the beginning, and it's really well done. I've seen it staged several times, and it's amazing. I've seen one where literally they took buckets of water and they were splashing buckets of water at the people in the play as they were, holding the the big wheel and all sorts. It's really well done. But they are in the middle, so it starts smack dab in the action. This is like a movie. And it's on stage. They had very little set decoration, and yet they would have done, with sound and all sorts of other things, they would have done something to really make it look like a ship is sinking, is going through a storm, and everybody's scared to death, and they'd be screaming, and there'd be storm sounds and everything. And then essentially we're wondering what's going to happen. They are all, oh no, we're, at first they're going to be okay, but are we going to make it through? Come on, let's go. And when there's a storm, everybody gets on board, and so everyone's doing all sorts of stuff, trying to get all of the stuff except for the higher class people. So all the boatswain and the master, and then more sailors come on, and then eventually we get Alonso, Sebastian, Antonio, Ferdinand, and Gonzalo. Now Alonso, remember, is the king. Sebastian's his brother. Now these are named in order of rank. supposedly. So Alonso, Sebastian, Antonio, so I guess Ferdinand, because he's not the king yet, is lower, and then Gonzalo, and then and others. But they're not going to help because they're upper class. They're just going to go, what are we going to do? Are we going to be able to, are we going to survive? And all that the boatswain says is keep below. And so that's kind of the import, is that you don't know how to do our job, so get out of the way. But they wanted, essentially Shakespeare wanted to make sure that we saw these people were on board altogether. Okay. And they're upper class. They're going to wear different clothing. In fact, they had what they called sumptuary laws. And if you were wearing upper class clothing and you were a lower class person, you could end up executed for that, at least put in jail. You could absolutely be fined, because no one's supposed to pretend to be a class they aren't. So they would all be up, dressed nicely. And then the boatswain and all these other people would be just, wearing regular, like, brown leather clothing and stuff like that. Nothing colorful, nothing trimmed, anything like that. So that's going to tell, as soon as they walk on stage, we're going to go, oh my gosh, these are the upper class people, and here are all the lower class people. Well, I think the pirates did. They also stole a lot of really fancy stuff. And so why not wear what they stole? So yeah, pirates. I love that you bring in pirates to something like that. We don't have pirates in this one, but that would be really cool. We should have, that's what Shakespeare missed. He didn't put pirates in here. And so he says, then the boatswain's been yelling, and he goes, do you not hear him? You mar our labor. In other words, you're getting in the way. Keep to your cabins. You do assist the storm. In other words, you're making it easier for us to founder, to shipwreck, because you're taking away attention by coming up onto the deck. Go downstairs. And Gonzalo, remember, he's one of that nice lord. He says, well, no, be patient. And he goes, when the sea is. So the boatswain's just being rude. Hence, what cares what these roars for the name of king? To cabin, silence, trouble us not. So this is not deference to like higher upper classes people. These are, excuse me, I have a job to do, get out of my way. And then Gonzalo says, good, yet remember whom thou hast aboard. In other words, wait a second, remember, okay, that's nice and all. Yes, you're trying to, survive the storm, but this is the king and a duke. That's what he's doing. And he goes, I don't care. He says, there's no one on board that I love more than myself. You are a counselor. If you could command these elements to silence and work the peace of the present, we will not hand a rope more. Use your authority. In other words, oh, if you could fix this, then fix it. But you can't. If you cannot, give thanks you've lived so long, and make yourself ready in your cabin for the mischance of the hour, if it so hap. In other words, if we end up foundering or we end up shipwrecking, you need to be ready. Out of our way, I say. And then Gonzalo doesn't fit anything. He says, I have great comfort from this fellow. Methinks he hath no drowning mark upon him. His complexion is perfect gallows. In other words, he's not going to die in a shipwreck. He's going to be hanged. So he's going to survive just because he's meant to eventually be hanged for crimes. No, well, see, the truth is everyone watching this was a mix. So we have the audiences at this time, yes, there were upper class people. The more upper class you are, the more likely you're going to be up in like the balcony area and viewing it from above. But then down at the bottom, you could get cheaper tickets. And then if you really wanted a cheap ticket, you could pay a penny or a pence and stand and watch the whole thing. If you go to London and go to the Globe today, you can actually pay, but it's a cheap ticket. You get a cheap ticket and you stand through the whole play. You actually stand in front of the stage with the penny public. And of course, it costs more than a penny, but it's still a lot cheaper than getting a balcony seat, which we were in the first balcony tier, and right up in front though. Yeah, so I was really happy. Our second time. And so, but if you're in the penny public, you don't get to sit. There's not room to sit. You have to stand through the whole production. But people did. And so those would be the lower class people. And so every class is represented in the audience. So they're going to get a big hoot of a laugh that the boatswain doesn't care. And he gives them a bit of his mind and tells them to get downstairs. And the truth is a lot of the lower classes would be like, yeah, the noble people are kind of useless. And so this is definitely a poke. They're poking fun. So it's even in the middle of this trauma where they're shipwrecking, there's comedy, which is just really interesting. That's why I said there's no, comedy or tragedy or a lot of these are just a mixture. There's some funny parts to Hamlet. Not really King. No, there's a little bit of funny in King Lear, but not a lot. But it's still possible that there could be humor in this. So then he essentially Gonzalo says, I don't think he's gonna die because he's gonna be hanged later. And so he's just gonna essentially leave. And they all leave. All the upper class people go back downstairs like they're supposed to. Then the boatswain comes back in and he's still yelling, come on, we got to start. And then somebody's crying, a plague upon this howling. They're louder than the weather or our office. And it's probably the noble people who are crying. And then Sebastian, Antonio, and Gonzalo come back out. And he's like, yet again, what do you have here? Should we give over and drown? Have you a mind to sink? And Sebastian he's not gentle. He just insults him. A pox of your throat, you bawling, blasphemous, uncharitable dog. The best insults come from Shakespeare. And the boatswain just says, work you then. In other words, get to work if you're going to yell at me. But of course, Sebastian is the brother of a king. Why would he work? He's not going to lift a hand. And Sebastian's not a nice dude. Remember, Sebastian and Antonio, they're going to do something later in the play that's bad. They're just bad people. And then Antonio does the same thing. Insult, insult, insult. Insolent noisemaker. We are less afraid to be drowned than thou art. In other words, we're not afraid of that. And so, but the boatswain's just trying to ignore it. And so he's giving more instructions. And the mariners come on and they're all wet. And they're like, all lost, to prayers, all lost, like we're going to lose the ship. And boatswain says, what must our mouths be cold? That just means they're going to die. Are they going to, be down? They're going to go down into the sea and drown. Yeah, the boatswain. I'm trying to leave me alone so I can do my job. Right, exactly. And Gonzalo says the king and prince are at prayers. Let's assist them, for our case is as theirs. So let's go pray. And that's Gonzalo. Remember, he's the nice dude. Yeah, the nobles are just they're insulting. Where's the manager? Is what they're saying, Jordan. And then the boatswain's like, I don't care. We're not talking to the manager. Go downstairs. But then Sebastian's he doesn't want to pray. He's out of patience, and calls the mariners drunkards. Calls the boatswain a wide-chapped rascal. Would thou mightst lie drowning, the washing of 10 tides. So essentially he's insulting him and saying, well, maybe you can just die. And Gonzalo says, no, he'll be hanged yet. So again, remember, he said he wasn't going to drown. He was going to die by hanging instead. And it says, though every drop of water swear against it and gape at widest to glut him, he's going to end up surviving. No, I don't think. I think it's more like, you mean the gape at widest to glut him? Oh, well, it's probably more that he is, what's the word? It's more likely that it's a reference to like rickets, because wide-legged, and that's more like he's bow-legged, which was a very common condition for people who were at sea because they didn't have vitamin C. And that's why, like England, all of their sailors, after a while, they bring limes on board, and they were called limeys. That's right. what they know now is actually tomatoes have more vitamin C. And so a lot of, especially if people are going to be on ships for a lot of time, that they make sure that tomatoes are very, and then you can also can tomatoes, limes, not so much, but yeah, limes, lemons, but they had to learn that. So for a while, if you were at sea for years and years, you could come back kind of looking funny. There were other things that you could get because of vitamin deficiencies too, but yeah, that's probably why he called him that. Now, well, now one thing I want to make sure, Brooke and all of y'all, I don't want to list everybody's name, but all of you, if you would just make sure you know, I'm not going to ask you about a particular line and say, Gonzalo said this. What does that mean? But I want you to get a gist of the fact that this is comedy as well as drama, all mixed together. And that the class, the friction between class structures is really there, and it's there all the way through the play. So we're going to have one middle class group, the drunkards, and they're going to try to overthrow somebody in the upper class, and that's of course never going to go anywhere because you can't do that. And in real life at that time you couldn't do that. There's no, if two noblemen were to have a duel, for instance, and shoot at each other, and one of them were to die, the other one might, take off for the continent for a little bit, go to France or something, and then come back maybe a couple years later, but he would never be prosecuted for it. If an unranked person were to face off in a duel with a ranked person, that unranked person would be probably executed. So the laws were different, and you had to really do horrible things to be prosecuted for those horrible things if you were upper class. You could get away with a lot of bad activities as long as you didn't do them against other upper class people. Okay, so now enough about the class stuff. And so everybody's yelling. Then because it says, and they really should have a space. This is all spaced wrong. So he says he gapes at Whitus to glut him, and then there's a confused noise within. All these people in the backstage are shouting out these things like they're on the ship, and oh no, mercy on us, we split. And then they're saying goodbye to their wife and kids, and then Antonio says, let's all sink with the king, and Sebastian says, let's take leave of him. And so they leave. And then Gonzalo says, now I would give 1,000 furlongs of sea for an acre of barren ground, long heath, brown furs, anything. So in other words, I would rather not be at sea. I would take an island. I'll take I don't want to drown, is what he's saying. I want dry land. Bring me dry land. And so so that's scene one. Scene two, we have totally shifted to another place, and yet it's the same stage. So they take off, if there's a steering, one of those big wooden steering things for the ship, all that's going to be gone. Anything they brought in to make it look like a ship is gone. And now we have who knows what, but sometimes it just says Prospero's cell, and it's probably in the center. There was a door in Shakespearean theater, and you could open it. So there was an interior, and then people could walk out of that interior. So probably the ship was on the side, or they left on the side, and then that door opened in the middle, and now we're in a different scene. So once everybody scoops off the stage, once you get to this, see this word exeunt, that just means everybody's gone. Everyone has exited. If you see exit, that just means that character has exited. But once you see the word exeunt, that means everybody's gone. So the stage is empty. Then Prospero comes out with Miranda. And Miranda is like a teenager. She's a little older teenager. She's like 15 or something. I think they actually established that in here, in this scene. But Miranda is Prospero's daughter. And she even calls her that from the beginning. So she says, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters. So she noticed the storm. They were watching the storm from the island, though. And yet she already says from the very beginning, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters. So she's saying, you did this, Dad. She's ascribing the force of this, the entire tempest, the big storm, to her father, which gives us already an indication. There are only three ways to know a character in drama: what that character says, what other people say to that character, and what other people say about the character when the character's not there. And so Miranda to her father is saying, you did this storm. You did it. And she says the sky, it seems, would pour down stinking pitch. So it was so black. It was such a dark storm. But that the sea, mounting to the welkin's cheek, dashes the fire out. And so it's like the sea was coming up to meet the storm that was coming down from the sky. And it was just a big tempest. And she goes, oh, I have suffered with those I saw suffer. A brave vessel, so a ship, who had no doubt some noble creature in her, dashed all to pieces. So she thinks the ship has been obliterated. Like he ripped the ship to shreds. If this were a revenge play, then he'd be revenged, right? Okay, a welkin, and I'm going to have to take out my phone because some of these words I have to look up because I just don't remember. But if you look at a welkin, let me just look it up real quick. It's the sky or heaven. And so the essentially the water rose up to meet the sky. Oh, and one thing too, most of us have a vocabulary of about 20,000 words if we're pretty educated, 25 if we're really educated. The Bible uses 11,000 words total between the Old and New Testament, 11,000. So about half of what our typical vocabulary is for a human being. Shakespeare used over 50,000 words. He coined thousands of words. He invented all kinds of words. So if you look up a lot of strange words, and it's gonna say the first time it ever appeared in print was Shakespeare, because he invented all kinds of words that I mean, literally. And he did a lot of what we call essentially taking one word that was a verb and making it into a noun. He did that all the time. And it had never been used before like that. So we coin words all the time. I don't know. I don't know if that's on, possibly, I don't know. But but we coin words all the time. We like, even the word Google, we once it got used as a web browser, but now we use it as a verb. Well, why don't you just Google that? And so that's a verb now, and it was a noun, a proper noun actually for a web browser. So we do this kind of stuff anyway. We're constantly adding words to our language and constantly losing words that we don't use anymore. And unfortunately, there are quite a few words in this that haven't probably been used in about 100 years or more. And so we don't know them. That's kind of like welkin. We would never use that word today to mean the sky. We would say the sky's cheap. So there are a few times when you might have to look something up, but it should be pretty easy to find it. Because all of these words, especially online, now that we have it at our fingertips, we can look up all sorts of stuff. If you really can't make sense of something, look it up. Look up the word, and you go, oh, okay. As soon as you say sky's cheek, well, that makes sense. It's just acting as if the sky is a person, and the sea rises up and brushes along the sky's cheek. Okay, that makes sense. Anyway, so she thinks that the ship's gone. And she says, oh, the cry did knock against my very heart. So she's very sympathetic, very kind natured. She didn't want anybody to be hurt on the ship. And she's very upset. So this is her dad who did it. And she's kind of bringing her dad, kind of saying, Dad, that was mean. Poor souls, they perished. Had I been any god of power, I would have sunk the sea within the earth before, that's or air, before it should the good ship so have swallowed, and the frotting souls within her. In other words, I would have made the sea go down. If I were a wizard, or a god, I would make this magic, use my magic to make the sea go down so that the ship they wouldn't have all drowned. Okay, that's what she's saying. So she goes, I wouldn't have been so mean, Dad. I'm putting it as real words as I can. And he says, be collected. In other words, calm down. No more amazement. Tell your piteous heart there's no harm done. So he said nobody got hurt. And she goes, oh, woe the day. She's still upset. So she's still crying. This is my daughter. This is what she would do. She'd be like, huh, they died. Um, the Marvel movie was really hard when we got to the halfway through those last two big movies, and a bunch of people died. And my daughter she left the movie theater crying. So that this is Miranda. And Prospero reiterates, no harm. I have done nothing but in care of thee. In other words, I only did this to help you, who art ignorant of what thou art. You don't know who you are. You don't know where I came from, nor that I am more better than Prospero, master of a full poor cell, and thy no greater father. Like, you only know me as Prospero. You don't know. Well, yay, he invented bedroom of all things. I know that, I mean, I know with a king, they'd call it like the private chambers. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's funny because that's what we always call it now. We don't ever, it's always our bedroom. That's really interesting. Hmm. And it's funny because in other languages, it's not called a bedroom, it's called a room. Well, where's so and so's room? And that means bedroom to us, but it's room. Oh, yay. If you can put in the link, Jordan, that way other people, because if they watch the video, they can actually access that link in the chat. Okay, so he says, you're crying, but there's no harm. Nobody was harmed. And you don't know why I did this because you don't even know who you are and you don't know who I am. And she says, well, I never cared to know. More to know did never meddle with my thoughts. It's a complicated way of saying it, but she's like, I never thought about needing to know more. And he says, 'tis time I should inform thee farther. Lend thy hand and pluck my magic garment from me. So he was in most of the plays. He's wearing like a big robe or something. Sometimes it's velvet and embroidered. The first one I ever saw, it was purple and it was made of feathers. It was the coolest thing I've ever seen. It was so awesome. But and then so she plucks it off when he's not going to do magic. When he's done doing magic, he takes it off. He only uses it when he's casting spells and stuff like that. And so now I need to tell you what's going on. So help me get my magic garment off. And he lays it down. There's actually a stage direction, lays down his mantle. And then he says, lie that he talks to it. Lie there, my art. Imagine, oh, what's the word? Like Dr. Strange and his moving cape or whatever. He sets it down, And then he goes to her and he says, wipe your eyes, wipe thou thine eyes, have comfort. And he says, it looked like a wreck, and it touched the very virtue of compassion in thee, but I so safely ordered it that there's no soul, not a single person. Oh, that's cool. But there's not a single person, not so much perdition as a hair betid to any creature in the vessel which thou heardst cry. So you saw it sink, you heard them cry, nobody got hurt. In fact, I didn't hurt a single hair on their head. So stop crying. And then he says, sit down, for thou must know farther. Now, I don't know if the these are thous are upsetting y'all. Did that mess with you, Addie, Brooke, Jordan, Smaya? Nah, okay, Jordan says no. If you read it out loud, like I'm doing, especially since you have a couple more acts to read for this week, read it out loud. If you read it out loud, you're going to get so much more. Did it become easier as you got along, as you went from act to act to act to act? Because it should. And if you were to continue, like if you were to say, okay, let me read another Shakespearean play, I get always write me. And if you want to read more Shakespeare, just write me, and I'll tell you which ones to start with, the ones that are easier. And then you can go, try. But the more you read it, the more it's going to be easy for you. Because literally, of all of the things I've read so far, the one that I had to look up was that Welkin. So, okay, so Miranda says, you've often begun to tell me what I am, but stopped. Oh, good. Oh, Brooke, you did that too. I used to do that with my sister. We'd read it together, and then she'd take voices and I'd take voices. We all took some characters. But the more you play around with it, and honestly, that's one reason I gave you the link to the production, because hearing it read, I mean, very few people would have just read these plays. They would have gone to see them. And so it's the only way I can say. That's why I try to talk about staging when I'm doing all these things too. Okay, so Miranda says, yeah, I bet it is. And you could make the evil ones like sound dastardly too. That's always fun. Okay, so Miranda says, you often started to tell me, but then stopped and said, stay, not yet. And then Prospero says, okay, but now the hour's come. The very minute bids ope thine ear. So listen, you open your ear and listen, obey and be attentive. Can you remember a time when we came into this cell? I do not think you can, for then you were not out 3 years old. So you weren't quite 3. And she goes, yeah, I can remember. Or maybe you weren't 4. Like when you say thou wast not out 3 years old. So I don't know if that means, well, you weren't quite 3 years old or you weren't 4 years old. So I'll just say she was, almost 4, but not 4 yet. And she goes, yeah, I can remember. And he goes, by what? What do you remember? Is there anything the image of anything the image tell me that have kept with remembrance? And she says it feels like rather like a dream than an assurance. Like I have a memory, but I don't know if it's real. And she goes, had I not 4 or 5 women once that tended me? Like I remember being surrounded by lots of other women. And he said, you did. That's exactly what, but how is it that this lives in thy mind? What seest thou else? What else do you remember from when you were a kid? In the dark, backward, and abysm of time. If thou rememberest aught ere thou camest here, how thou camest here thou mayest. In other words, if you remember stuff from back then, you may remember how we got here. And she goes, but I don't remember more stuff. And he says, 12 years since, Miranda, so she's probably almost 16, thy father was the Duke of Milan and a prince of power. And she says, well, aren't you my father? And he says, yeah, your mother was a piece of virtue, and she said you were my daughter. In other words, your mother was very virtuous. She said you were my daughter, so I assume that, yes, I am your father. Which is a funny answer, but that's what he answers. He says, and your father was the Duke of Milan. In other words, I was the Duke of Milan, and thou his only heir and a princess. Because that's what they called the Duke's daughter, would be a princess. And she goes, oh heavens, what foul play had we? How did it happen? What bad stuff happened to us? What did somebody do that made it so all this stuff was taken? Or was it blessed? Were we blessed by not having all that stuff? And he says both. It was both good and bad. By foul play, as you say, we were heaved thence, but blessedly holp hither. But holp just means helped. It's just past tense, but we don't use that anymore. Holp. I was holp yesterday. No, we were helped. So in other words, there was foul play that happened that put us on a boat and chucked us away and took away my dukedom. But then I was also helped, and that's why I've been able to live the way we have. Okay. And And she says, "Oh, my heart bleeds to think of the teen that I have turned you to, which is from my remembrance. Please you farther." In other words, she's saying, "Tell me more." That's what this part right here. Please you farther. It sounds, although when she'd say it, especially in British English, it would sound like father. And it's just, I don't even know what to do with that. I guess do it in American. And so this is his story. This is what happened and how it happened. My brother and your uncle, Antonio, and he keeps saying, "I pray thee mark me," which means she's not paying attention, which is also kind of funny. I've seen this done really well where she's like pulling, petals from a flower and not really listening. But it also means that he can repeat elements so that, because this is really crucial stuff. And yet it's just kind of, there's no real stage business that goes with it. So the audience, he might lose the audience this way too. So he's like, "Mark me." He says that a brother should be so perfidious. He whom next thyself of all the world I loved. So I loved Antonio, my brother, and yet he was a bad dude. He was perfidious. So I put him essentially as my steward. I I put him as the manager of my state. So he was like the second in command. As at that time, through all the signories, it was the first, and Prospero the prime duke, being so reputed in dignity and for the liberal arts without parallel. So this is a really, I was the head duke, but I really liked all the other stuff. So I was, all the other things that the duke was allowed to do and was in charge of, that became all of my study. Yeah, American English is actually more like what they would have spoken. It actually is, it probably sounds a bit with a little bit Scottish in it and a little like more of a back in your throat kind of guttural, but it sounds, yeah, it's far closer to American English than it is the way British people speak today. And it's mostly because we've moved. Populations that move find that their language changes very little. Populations that stay in one place and don't move generation after generation, their language changes more. And we don't know why. I mean, maybe I'm not a language, I'm not a linguist, so I don't know, but it's just kind of the way it is. So yeah, so it's weird. It's why if people have lived in the South for a very long time, they tend to have more of an accent than if they've moved around the country. So I've lived all over the place. So I was born in Arizona, lived here a lot, South Carolina, Washington State, the Midwest, and because of that, I have a much more standard accent. I have little touches from different things, like I can say "y'all," but I I just have a more standard accent. It's because I've been to many places, and so my accent kind of like flattens out. But yeah, you can read this. Don't read this British. You'll notice that I'm not reading it with a British accent because it really probably wouldn't have sounded like that anyway. So I'm not going to add a bunch of foofiness to it to make it harder to understand. Okay, so he says, "The government I cast upon my brother, and to my state," that's the state he was supposed to govern, "grew stranger, being transported and wrapped in secret studies." So in other words, he was doing his alchemy stuff. "Thy false uncle," that's Antonio. And then he says, "Dost thou attend me?" And she goes, "Oh yes, totally. I'm absolutely listening, sir, most heedfully." And he's probably looking at her like, I don't know that you're listening. But then he said, essentially, being once perfected how to grant suits, how to deny them, who to advance and who to trash for overtopping, new created the creatures that were mine, I say, or changed them, or else new formed them. So essentially, he, the brother, Antonio, figured out how to do all of the inner workings, all of the offices of the Duke. And that means working politically with people, working with courtiers, making alliances, all this other stuff. While he was in his office studying, Prospero was, all by himself, Antonio was networking. And so he could change the rules. He could make new rules. And he had both the key of the officer and office. And so essentially, he set everyone to follow him. Antonio did. No, it's okay, Brooke. Oh my gosh, we have to go, y'all. And we're not even close to finishing this. So we will stop right there. I'm just going to leave it up and I'll explain Prospero's deal. I'll try to go faster next time. Bye. Sorry about this, y'all. I don't want to go way over. So it's 5:07. So I will see you if you can come tomorrow to one of the 2 sessions. Great. I will have a session next Monday, but only if you are having last minute issues with your papers and stuff. Okay. Bye.
Bye.